Welcome to all in this special keynote session. I think it's the last keynote of our conference. Let me warmly welcome you all, and perhaps a few more people will trickle in as we get started. So my name is Clémentine Rossier. I'm at the University of Geneva. I'm a demographer at the University of Geneva. But I'm here today with my IUSSP hat. I'm a member of the council. I was a member for 4 years. And when we were preparing the program, the organizing committee decided we needed to create some special session on important topics who would stimulate a large number of demographers. So this is how we turned to Wolfgang Lutz, and to present his work on a demographically inspired indicator of human well-being. And we were very happy that Wolfgang agreed to give this talk. So it is hardly necessary to introduce Wolfgang Lutz, of course. He's among the most prominent demographer in the world today. But let me tell you a few words about him. For those who don't know him, he's at IASA in Vienna, and he's especially known for his work on population projections and his interest in promoting education as a key demographic variable to be introduced when doing projections. And lastly, he has been thinking about the population environment link. And this is the topic on which we wanted to listen him today. So Wolfgang has very widely published. He has a very impressive publication list, and he has gained many prestigious awards, among which the Matei Dogen Award from us, IUSSP. So audience, I don't know how many people are here now, but you are here probably as a demographer, and probably you may have been wondering how our discipline can contribute to sustainability science, to the debate about this challenge we're all facing in the world. And so far in demography, you probably have been noticing that we have been studying the impact of climate change on migration, for example, or health, or even reproductive behaviors. But although interesting, these still are pretty specialized interests, right? And I think Wolfgang's argument, which I've been also thinking about, and that's why I was especially interested in sharing this session, is that demographers, after all, work on well-being, and so human well-being, and so are especially well placed to propose new indicators or interesting, important indicators to move the reflection forward in this general field. So let us now hear what Wolfgang has to say to us about that. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clementine, for these nice introductory words. I will now try to share my screen. Okay. So greetings from Luxembourg Castle, the home of IASA, a little south of Vienna. We have a wonderful winter day with lots of snow plus sunshine outside, and it's soon getting dark, so I had to switch on the artificial light already. So the title is a slight modification of what you've just seen before, because I wanted to make clear what is the role of demography of our discipline in the study of sustainable human well-being, and then what is the specific role of a human capital. So what are the topics I'm going to talk about? We'll at the beginning briefly summarize what I think that demography can contribute to the study of human well-being. And then step back a bit to some field of philosophy. What do we try to measure? What is what are we really after, and focus on this divide between objective and subjective well-being indicators, which is really two very different schools of analysis and schools of thinking. And then I will talk a bit about what is meant by sustainability science and what is the well-being function, trying to explain human well-being as based on a number of capitals. And then we are moving towards a tailor-made well-being indicator. And I'll specify 6 criteria or 6 desiderata that such an indicator should hold, and then introduce the indicator, which is called years of good life, and then show you some first empirical data, and then give an outlook. What are the next big research questions to really see this as as an indicator of long-term human well-being, even in a sustainable development context, and focus on the role of education and human capital. All right, well, first let's think about why demography in this field. There's a whole big international society of quality of life studies. So the economists have their own subdisciplines looking at well-being indicators of all sorts. Why should the demographers enter this field? And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think demography has something really unique to contribute to this. The first, as we'll hear, is that the length of the human life must be a key constituent of any well-being indicator. If you don't sort of have the length of life in there, you can always optimize any other indicator by eliminating the weaker elements of a population. Like if you want to eliminate, so you want to increase the average income, you just somehow eliminate the poorer people, unless this is illegal in the sense that it is built into the indicator that the length of life is clearly a key constituent. And then the main tool that we all know is the life table, and in particular also the Sullivan method, in which we adjust overall life expectancy for what we call good life expectancy, good years of life. Near survival cannot be our goal, but it's survival in a good status, however this is defined. The second contribution that demographers is really modeling the changing composition of population, something that Norman Ryder called demographic metabolism. And I've been writing more about sort of a more general theory of demographic metabolism, in which we can generalize this intergenerational replacement, cohort replacement, through which societies change in a regular and even predictable way along age and cohort-specific constituents of well-being. So these constituents are health status, poverty status, even life satisfaction, some characteristics of people that tend to be relatively stable and not volatilely change from one year to the other. So that can help with the estimation and some of the reconstructions that I showed you. And finally, the tools of multidimensional population dynamics can forecast the human capital formation, the changing educational attainment compositions, which turns out to be a key determinant of well-being. So in a way, we always have to distinguish between the constituents of well-being that can be measured and modeled by demographic tools, as well as the determinants of well-being. So I think there are lots of reasons why demographers should enter this field. The basis of what I'm talking is mostly been published in a paper earlier this year. Years of Good Life is a well-being indicator designed to serve research on sustainability. And you see a list of the co-authors here, and I'm very grateful to all of them, and much of the work that I will present, actually the calculations and some of the analysis has been done by these co-authors. So it's really a group effort, which by the way is part of my currently ongoing ERC advanced grant on sustainable human well-being. So let's step back a bit and ask sort of, is there such a thing as universal values, and what is a good life? And don't be afraid, I only have 2 slides on philosophy, but I think it's necessary. And this discussion really started in already among the ancient Greek, where particularly Aristotle has posed this question: what is the ultimate purpose of human existence? What is it, to what end or goal is it worth that we direct all of our efforts, all of our activities in this book, the Nicomachean Ethics? Maybe at this point, I should put in a bit of a personal note. I actually started out studying philosophy right after high school and went also to study mathematics and theology. I really was interested in so many things and couldn't focus. And at that time, a wise old man was very helpful, Hans Zacher, actually, who later turned out to be the president of the Max Planck Society, who also was instrumental in establishing the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock. He told me, well, Wolfgang, you better look for a specific, interesting, small discipline. And that was demography. It was the perfect choice. And then he said, once you are 65, you can still become a philosopher. Well, as it happens, today is my 65th birthday. And so as of tomorrow, I probably will be more of a philosopher than in the past. But here I'll stick to just a few philosophical comments. So what Aristotle has talked about is in Greek oidaimonia, and this has very different translations. More generally, some people say it's happiness, others call it life satisfaction, and we talk about the difference between these concepts, where life satisfaction is more reflective. That's clearly what Aristotle had more in mind, that we sort of able to meet our own aspirations, also a fulfilled life. And he's also talked about just a good life. And this is really sort of the notion that for this indicator, we picked up the good life as sort of the most general attribute of what kind of life we want. I'm just going to be very selective in the history of thought, picking out a few thinkers who have been contributing to this topic, and also highlighting some of the importance of survival and happiness by itself. So Thomas More, or More in English, he lived in England and wrote about the utopia, a fictional egalitarian society. And there the values matter a lot. And he makes it very clear that the most fundamental value is life itself, followed by happiness. Well, here we are again with happy life. And then just picking up another thinker of our times, Manfred Max Neef. He lived in Chile, and he's famous for introducing a general matrix of human needs, satisfaction, or what he called basic needs, with regard to oneself, the social group, and also the environment. And he put sort of 9 aspects, axiological needs on there. But he also says that all these values are considered to be equal, with one important exception, and that is to remain alive. So being alive really is more important than anything else, because otherwise we cannot enjoy any quality of life, which seems to make sense. Well, of course, we cannot talk about this topic without mentioning Amartya Sen and his capability approach. He talks about 3 interrelated factors, sort of the functioning, doing, and being, then the freedom, which for him is the range of choices you have. It's almost synonymous to development. And then the conversion efficiency, which is the ability of a person to convert his or her resources into an achieved functioning. So Amartya is considered the father of also the United Nations Development Program, a Human Development Index, which consists, as you all know, of life expectancy, income, and education. And this is in many respects sort of the benchmark for sort of the indicators of development. Martha Nussbaum has been building on a sense capability approach and extended the theory with a list of 10 central human capabilities as a precondition of minimum human development. So Martha Nussbaum claims indeed that this capability approach is universalistic, so valid for all societies at all times. The first among the central human capabilities, which should be granted to every human being, is being alive, which is not dying prematurely or before one's life is reduced to be not worth living. Well, particularly this specification of Martha Nussbaum has been guiding us in this definition of this indicator, years of good life, as I will soon explain. My colleague Anastasia Liadi here, as part of the project team, also did a major summary of the literature of different theories of well-being, and she identifies 3 common priorities: positive social interaction, the fulfillment of basic needs, and subjective well-being. But again, the value of survival, being alive, is claimed to be a very central issue in all of these theories. Now, as you know, there is a huge variety of indicators out there. Almost any organization that is active in this field of judging whether humankind is moving in the right direction has its own indicators. Some of them, like the Happy Planet Index, they give more weight to the environment. Others give more weight to economic development. So what we've done in this PNAS paper, we have an overview of 31 different indicators that have been recently proposed. I don't go through them. I just copied like 2 of them that are rather prominent at the moment. There is sort of the OECD Better Life Index, which also has some theoretical foundations in the Stiglitz and Sen report on measuring our lives, and also is partly based on the capabilities approach. They have 11 indicators that you see there, from the material conditions and quality of life. They bring it out every 2 years. And the question, of course, is if you have these 11 indicators, how do you weight them? That has been already a hotly debated issue in the Human Development Index. You have these different aspects that matter for well-being, but how do you combine them into one indicator when you want to see rank the countries or populations or subpopulations or whatever? And so the OECD is quite flexible. Like, as a default, they give each of these indicators equal weight, which is, of course, a problem, because then you make implicit assumptions of trade-off, that sort of an improvement in one of these indicators can compensate for a decline in another one. So you make explicit assumptions about the trade-offs, and that's why the OECD allows every user to have his or her own weights. So you can give more weight to health than to the environment, or vice versa, which makes it, of course, very hard to then compare the overall number across countries and across time. Another prominent example is the World Happiness Report that is put out by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which Jeffrey Sachs is essentially leading, and they also put together regular estimates, and for them, sort of happiness, as the title says of the happiness report, is a key element, more than for the OECD. Now, let me step back yet and see like what this whole community of scholars that is dealing with sustainable development is trying to do in this field. There is a branch of science called sustainability science. Particularly in the US and the US National Academy of Sciences, they have a special working group on sustainability sciences. And also PNAS has a special section that is called sustainability science, while in other countries, this is less of a scientific group, established scientific group. Yes, in the US, at least in the National Academy, it is. And much of the discussion is really about this central, what I call here, a well-being production function. Like Bill Clark and others have written about this. So you have on the left-hand side the well-being of a certain population at a certain point in time, which is a function, first of all, of different capital assets. So they have manufactured capital, which is the more typical economic capital. Then they have human capital, which is the skills and knowledge of humans, and the health of humans is there. And then they have natural capital, which is something new there for economists to really consider all the ecosystem services and all the things that nature gives us to allow us to function and to produce well-being. On top of this, there's also recognized the role of institutions like laws, norms, expectations, and knowledge and science, or the qualified knowledge is identified here as a sort of a separate force. So much of the work, estimation work, and in particular the influential work by Partha Gupta of Cambridge, really has focused on these capitals and the importance of natural capital added to the economic capital, and with the assumption that if there's a decline in some of the capitals, that will negatively impact on the human well-being. But to estimate empirically any such function, we do need quantitative indicators of the W, of the well-being. And that has been the purpose of this project, trying to come up with an indicator of W. Okay, now let us discuss a bit 6 desiderata or criteria for such a well-being indicator. Well, the most important probably is that it needs to be widely, if not universally, accepted as something that is desirable as an ultimate end. And I sometimes said that this is really something that a Buddhist monk and a nomad, as well as a Wall Street broker, needs to subscribe to. They need to be saying, yes, I care about this. It's not so much what values drive you to do actions, whether you are more egalitarian or more hierarchical, but what you consider as important for yourself and your friends and family in particular. And there is clearly, as we'll discuss, the avoidance of premature death is really one of the most important of this. So that's the universality, and I already mentioned that Martha Nussbaum believes that this capability approach really has a universal applicability. The second is it needs to be based on characteristics of individuals that can be flexibly aggregated to subpopulations. And that's already something that we have demographers, of course, used to dealing with, but many of the other indicators don't apply, as if they are based on a national accounting, like if the Human Development Index takes some massaged form of GDP, per person adjusted for purchasing power and whatever standardized, but it is based on national accounting, which means it can only be assessed for nations. You cannot have a GDP for women separately for that of men, as we do have sort of life expectancy or health status or whatever we're going to consider really for gender specific, but also specific for different ethnic groups, regions, or whatever we are interested in. So that's the second prerequisite. The third is that it needs to be comparable over time and across subpopulations. Again, some indicators, like for instance, the life expectancy in the Human Development Index standardizes for the highest life expectancy at the given point in time. So it's really hard to project it into the future. You need to modify it somewhat. So it needs to be best in its absolute value, have a meaning. Okay, then it should also be theory-based and not include implicit trade-off assumptions or arbitrary weighting schemes. We've discussed this already, and even given equal weight to each of the aspects, in a way, is an arbitrary weighting scheme. There needs to be sufficient empirical information for different subpopulations and time points to be fit for serving as a dependent variable in the panel regression. So we need to have enough empirical data. And as I will show you, there is an issue, but at least we feel that there's enough data that we can start with estimating it for some populations. And often there's, of course, a feedback. If you put an interesting indicator out on the table, then statistical agencies or survey agencies will try to collect the data that are necessary for building this. So there is sort of a mutual influence in this. And then this is not absolutely necessary, but it would be nice if possible. You have a substantive interpretation in terms of a real life analogy, rather than just being an abstract index, saying that our well-being is 0.38. Well, what does it mean? Is it a lot or not? I mean, you can only interpret it relative, but if you say that I have an expectation of living, let's say, 63 years and in a good condition, in good life, that has a better real life analogy. Okay, now this is the essential design of this. It's sort of, we start out with the gray area in the background. This is years of life, being alive. That is by period life expectancy approximated. And then I already mentioned at the beginning, we have two very different schools of thinking. One only believing in objective indicators. And here we have the three, like also following the Amartya Sen's capability approach, being out of poverty, being free from physical as well as cognitive limitations. And then we have the other group of scholars, and they also include quite some economists. It's not that all economists would be for the objective indicators, they only want to see the subjective indicators. Many of you may know Richard Easterlin, a famous population economist who happened also to be my teacher in population economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has also been made some major contributions to happiness research. That's what he's known for mostly in the economics field. And I've sent him some of these papers for comments, and he wrote back, Wolfgang, I should warn you, I will never agree to any welfare indicator that is not subjective, because this is the only thing that matters in the end. So he said that that's what people, they perceive it this way, and that's the only thing that matters, whether people perceive that this is good for them or not. Whatever the objective indicators are is of secondary importance. Well, you already see these are rather incompatible. So what should we do if we want to have a universally accepted indicator? So our approach has been that you have to be, a year is counted as a good year if you are above certain minimal levels, both on the objective as well as on the subjective quality of life. So if you are doing very well on objective indicators, but are deeply unsatisfied with your life, this year is not going to be counted as a good year, and the other way around. Well, this illustrates this in some way. Just quickly how this is going to be calculated. I already mentioned the Sullivan method. So we just in a life table, when we sum up the person years, the big LI, we have this PI, which is the prevalence of the state of interest. Let's say that at a given age I, only half of the people are above the minimum levels on these subjective and objective indicators, then P would be 0.5, and then you just calculate life expectancy for a given year. Usually we don't do it at birth, but at the age of 20, mostly because subjective life satisfaction is hard to test with children, so it's only for adults. Yeah, just in the life table, for those of you who are not familiar with the Sullivan method, so you have the capital T, which is the cumulated person years, and then you multiply the capital L with this PI, which is the proportion of the person years counted as good years, and then again you have the sum up these weighted person years from the bottom. So you then see that the life expectancy, which is EI here, is typically higher because P is below 1. So in this particular example, where the life expectancy at the age of 20 it would be 54.9. The Yogel, the years of good life to be expected at age 20, is only 41.8. Just quickly in terms of the data and how we go about in practical ways, life expectancy, fortunately, is available by the UN estimate for every country in the world since 1950. So that is an empirical basis if we do it at the national level. Being free from physical limitations, we have different sources, the World Value Survey, the World Health Survey, and they will show in particular the survey of health, aging and retirement in Europe is a particularly valuable source of data. Being out of poverty, we also have some World Value Survey data checked and balanced with some World Bank poverty rate information. Being cognitively able, this is also a sort of tested literacy and tested numeracy. And then for life satisfaction, we have the standard question in the World Value Survey, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? And you can go from 1 to 10, and as you will see, if you are above 4, then this is considered as sufficient. If you only are at the very low end of this scale, then this is considered to be unsatisfied life. Yeah, you see here some of the countries for which we have the data ranked, starting with Sweden, Netherlands, Germany. China comes on quite early, and Chile. So it's not the usual income ranking or even life expectancy ranking. It's quite a different kind of ranking that we find. And at the bottom, you find Yemen, Rwanda, and even Morocco and Egypt, who are more developed. And India also is not doing very well here either. Now let's zoom in a little more into 3 countries. India, Mexico, and South Africa, because it also is interesting if you look at the trend over time, as well as decompose it by the different constituents of well-being. Let's see India. So on top, the gray line is life expectancy, has increased from 51 to 54 over this 15-year period here. But you see yoga at the bottom is much lower in India, but it has increased somewhat steeper from 15 to 23 years at the age of 20. How many additional years of good life can Indian women in this case expect? And it partly has to do with that you see the flat line in red, that sort of the cognition, mental health has not improved. This is sort of based on numeracy tests and literacy tests. Whereas out of poverty has quite significantly improved. There was some progress in poverty alleviation, and you see also the health has improved less. So all these different things go in a little different rates of improvement in different countries. Mexico has the highest yoga of these 3 countries, and you see life expectancy still increased moderately from 59 to 61 years. The life satisfaction, sort of the satisfied life expectancy, if you want, that's what we show here, increased also, but it's a little lower. Again, in the out of poverty life expectancy, there has been a significant increase, but much less in the cognition. And if sort of you have to be considering all these factors into account, then the joint yoga years of good life is actually relatively low, from 37 to 40 years, but still better than in the 2 other cases. South Africa is an interesting case because their life expectancy has actually declined. This has to do with the AIDS pandemic, and life satisfaction has slightly increased, but you see also the health has decreased due to the AIDS situation. But still overall, despite of a decline in life expectancy and in health, you still see an increase in yoga from 19 to 24 years, quite significant for women in South Africa, due to the improvement of the other dimensions. Well, this is now for males. It's, in India, you see a more rapid increase. So that is the biggest difference between these slides, that in India, men are relatively doing better, gaining more rapidly years of good life than women, whereas in the other countries, the difference is not so big. Now, time is running, and I just say that we do have some definitions of how we measure these, and this, of course, depends on the source of data that we have. The most useful data, because it really has all of these different pieces, these dimensions, in one survey is indeed this share survey. The problem is that share only exists for people above the age of 50. So what you see here is the remaining of the years of good life to be expected beyond the age of 50. And you see it here for several countries in share, and also broken down by level of education, because now we enter this question about the role of education, human capital, in life satisfaction as well as health and all the constituents of well-being. So you see in this graph, like for Denmark, the first is the transparent in the back, that's total life expectancy, and the solid in the foreground is the yoga, which you see a consistent pattern with actually the education differences in yoga tend to be greater, stronger than the education differences in mortality, life expectancy alone. Italy is interesting because in Italy you see a relatively little difference in life expectancy between the low and medium education groups, but still some change in the low, and sorry, the high and medium, and some decline for the low, and for yoga this difference is more pronounced. You also see in Eastern Europe, Estonia or Slovenia, really the the difference in years of good life by level of education is much more pronounced than in some of the Western and Northern European countries. Just a quick view we try to really go very long series. I happened to do my dissertation on Finnish fertility since 1722, and I show it because this is the world's longest ongoing annual demographic time series. Here you just have the birth and death rates, and but we also have very good historical information. So with the help of Claudia Reiter, we have sort of made some reconstructions for Finland. Of course, we don't have any subjective life satisfaction data, but we can sort of impute them indirectly through all kinds of other indicators, including also the marriage rate fluctuation from one year to another. So what is interesting here that you see the gray is the since 1860 in Finland life expectancy, and the blue line is Jogl. You see these ups and downs, particularly the big famine that Finland had in 1868, where sort of both went down, and then you had World War I and the Spanish flu, then you had World War II. But then particularly since World War II, you see that the gap between the two has been narrowing. This was the case that sort of poverty helped to improve, as well as these cognitive skills, health status. So these constituents of well-being that are not directly related to mortality have improved more rapidly than mortality rates. But you also see for the last 20, 30 years, the distance has stayed almost constant. So Jogl has not approximated life expectancy more directly. And this has to do with population aging, of course, that you have among the elderly, you always have healthy years of life do not increase more rapidly in Finland than the total life expectancy. And so we can expect for the future a narrower, but then relatively constant Jogl. That's what the Finnish data show you. Now, a last empirical application that a very recent paper by three of my other colleagues, they have estimated the Jogl for all countries, for 140 countries in the world. Again, based on the UN life expectancy data, and then some estimates and whatever World Bank or other information we could get for these countries. And you see a relatively constant increase, except for this red. These are African countries, where again in the 1990s, the steep decline you see is associated with the AIDS pandemic and interesting recovery. But overall, you see a broad span that is broader than the span just for life expectancy alone. It's more diverse across the planet. So what are the big challenges? And I'm slowly coming to the end of my presentation, the next challenge, once we sort of defined the indicator and have started to measure it, sort of estimate this well-being production function based on sets of capitals. And the other is even more difficult, to look into the future and make scenarios where we also incorporate some possible feedbacks of, for instance, climate change or biodiversity loss or air pollution or whatever environmental effects we have on mortality, on the objective indicators, but also on life satisfaction. So this is a daunting task, but only then, if we're able to do this, it can really be used as a sustainability criterion. Here, very recently, my colleague Eric Strisnik has sort of run a statistical model where he tried to quantify these three capitals that we've seen in the well-being production function of sustainability science. And as you see, indeed, the mean years of schooling, that's the human capital, the first variable, is very highly significant and positive in its contribution. Even if you take out the AIDS countries or take out countries who have a very high air pollution, this PM 2.5 is an indicator of air pollution. And then you also have the economic capital, which has some significance, but much less than the human capital. And as expected, the air pollution does have a negative. The problem with taking these environmental capitals is really that sometimes the lag is huge. I mean, for climate change, we don't really see the consequences already now, only just mild first consequences, but not in a massive way yet. Air pollution is relatively quickly affecting the health of people, as well as also the life satisfaction of people who live in very polluted areas. So this is just a step into this direction. And again, to highlight this, the data set with respect to education. So here you see countries Yogurt at age 20 with respect to those proportion of at least lower secondary education. The problem here is that you have many countries on the left-hand side that have almost no lower secondary, and also others that have universal. But in the middle field, you see an increase, and you see that the increase does not flatten. That if you see with respect to income, for instance, it flattens after a while. It does not further increase. With respect to education, it continues to increase. And here, if we look at another, this is the mean years of schooling of the population above the age of 60. Fortunately, our Wittgenstein Center Data Explorer allows us to really have all these age-specific education distributions. And here we see that particularly because it's the health and the disability of the elderly that makes a big impact here, that here we still see this upward trend. There is no leveling up visible. So for the future, this would also imply that as the older people of the future get better educated, and we know that they will be better educated because they already are in their 40s and 50s today, and we know what their education is, which is better than those of the 70, 80-year-old today. So we would also expect that this increase in the years of good life will continue. Now, the very last thing is how do we factor in the feedback into human well-being as affected by climate change or other environmental changes. And here it's very important as we laid out in this paper in Nature Climate Change with Raya Mutarak, that we really not look at the population of today, which is influencing the climate, but the population of the future T+X, which will be affected by future climate change. So again, we need populations forecast because I said, and many institutions make this mistake of matching the climate of the future with the population of today. Even the World Health Organization, when they came up with estimates of how many people will die in Eastern Africa of malaria under climate change, what they took the public health capabilities of today and matched it with the climate of the future. Of course, societies are also improving, their capabilities are improving all the time. And that's why we need these demographic projections, not only by age and sex, but also by level of education or other relevant human characteristics that matter for resilience of future societies to these environmental changes. And this is the graph that you just sort of know that in demography, we can go decades into the future because of the slow process of demographic metabolism. If we know the education of one cohort, we know the education distribution of the cohort 20 years later at a 20-year-old higher age, and only have to adjust for differential mortality and migration in the meantime. So that is this very strong analytical handle that we have. Unlike any other social science, I dare to say, we are in a better position to produce long-term scenarios of social change. And this is the last slide here. How does this affect? There was a paper by, again, my colleague Eric Struissing and Raya Mutarak in Science, where we had 3 different scenarios, these so-called shared socioeconomic pathways that are being used now by the climate change modeling community widely. It's often reflected also in the IPCC reports. So what you see here is the rapid development scenario, SSP1, and the stalled development scenario. You see, the rapid development overall world population will not even reach 9 billion and then decline, and you will have a much better educated population. You see, the majority of the population will have secondary or tertiary education in the second half, whereas the stalled development, you go for a population of more than 12 billion, with little further improvement in education. Now, if you match this with different climate hazards, so here we're looking at a disaster, death in millions. Either we have sort of a constant hazard of these tropical storms, or we increase it by 10% or 20%, and then match it with these socioeconomic scenarios. So you see that the blue lines, this gives you the stalled development, the SSP3. Sort of if there's no change in the climate hazard, it's roughly constant. but with a 10 or a particular 20% increase, you see a rapid increase in the likely fatalities, people dying due to disasters that are related to climate change. But if you look at a rapid development scenario with rapidly improving capabilities due to better education, you see these red lines actually are all lower than today. This means that if the societies develop the capabilities in accordance with their resilience as assumed under this scenario, then under climate change, actually the future will imply fewer climate deaths, despite of these massive changes that we are looking at. So the whole question, how dangerous will climate change be for human well-being, depends to a large extent on how human societies evolve in the future, how their resilience will evolve. And for this, demographic modeling can play a key role. And yeah, you may have heard in the COP in Glasgow, they discussed a lot about this huge $100 billion green climate fund that at the moment all goes into sort of engineering projects, build sea walls to help these countries fight climate change. And our point is here, well, not only give the money to engineers, we also need to give the money to educators to make these people more empowered to then flexibly react to whatever the future challenges are. Okay, I'll stop on this point with a small advertisement for this book that just came out. It's an Advanced Introduction to Demography, where I really try to bring together the recent writings on multi-dimensional demography and how demography as a discipline becomes much more relevant to the rest of the world if we go beyond just focusing on age and sex, but also factor in human capital, labor force participation, and all these other demographic variables. With this, I thank you for your attention, and I'll stop my slideshow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. And I would add sex and age, but also empowerment, because in your latest indicator, you really address the issue of empowered years of life. Yes. So I think this was really convincing, especially for somebody who read all that literature that was cited there. There is so much behind this. Of course, lots to debate still, and I hope we will have some of this debate here. So let's just raise your hands if you have comments or questions. You can also put something in the chat if you want to interact that way. I can read your question as well. So please. Jump in. And while you guys may get ready to jump in, of course, I have a series of questions or reflections. Perhaps the first one that struck me is your insistence on having one indicator of well-being. So listening to you, I understand that this equation is really your starting point, right? This W on the left is what you want to get at. But you also know that of course, in the SDGs, how many objectives, how many goals, sub-goals, indicators are we dealing with? And actually, there are also other version of the SDGs which are a bit more economic or visual, and those versions still, I'm thinking about the donut economic, for example, of Kay Raworth. Those ones get down to 9 or 10 social foundations, indicators for social foundation, or even think about Martha Nussbaum, which you also built, which is in your foundation. Well, also they deal with about 10 indicators. So given that you want to reach a minimum in each of these indicators, and in each of on these dimensions, why do you want to summarize everything in one instead of having something with 10 dimensions, say?
Yeah.
So this is
Well,
the first question.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This is indeed a very important and very relevant question. And I'm not saying that all the assessments should exclusively focus on one indicator, but there is a clear need for a summary indicator. And particularly, you mentioned Sustainable Development Goals. I happen to be one of this group of 15 independent scientists charged by the UN Secretary General to produce the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019, which is the first 4-year assessment of how it's going. And yes, as you know, there are not only these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but 169 targets. So you are flooded with indicators on these 169 targets. And what happens is that most of the people, they don't see the forest for the trees. They got very much hooked up on one specific indicator of one specific target that they happen to care around. So it's there. And then, of course, some of these targets are in conflict with each other. You cannot be making progress on both at the same time. So there are these trade-offs. So we've been in that group struggling quite a bit. We haven't come up with any joint indicator in that group, in this Global Sustainable Development Report, but clearly indicated the desirability of also having well-integrated indicators, which are not based on this sort of more or less arbitrary weighting. That's always, if you have multiple indicators, then you just give each indicator equal weight, which, as I said, there are many implicit trade-offs and what is the scientific basis for this weight. So I'm not saying that this multidimensionality is unimportant. And as you've seen, like when we look at the yogurt trends in some of the countries like India and South Africa, where I showed it, it actually is richer if you show like from which of the components of the well-being, like the health component or the cognition component or the poverty component, does this variation come from? But still, at the end of the day, whether you want to see, is this all moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? I think it is very helpful to have a common metric. And it's not a coincidence that the GDP per capita has become such a powerful, ubiquitous measurement, because it is a single number that tries to summarize a country's economic performance, and many took it even as the overall performance, how well countries are doing, despite all of the shortcomings. So in a way, I think yoga is much better than GDP in measuring the well-being of people, but it's clearly not the only indicator.
I see, I have a reply to that, but it's our further questions. I see that Tom has also, Tom, do you want to jump in and make your comment?
Sorry, I'm trying to, yeah, I found the presentation really interesting, and I especially liked returning to the basic philosophy. I think that that's unusual among us demographers who spend all our time counting, and I thought this was very good. But I think your approach will be very, very difficult to apply as you try and look into the future, and especially population and environmental scenarios, which I know is something that interests you. There are extraordinarily difficult and almost philosophical or ethical considerations. What is the value of somebody who has never been born and who may never be born in a specific scenario? How do you take that into account? You're placing a great deal of importance on life expectancy, which I think is a good thing. But it means that you're, given the way you're constructing your indicator, to go even further back, you're kind of midway between average and total utility. And when you're looking at the future, your metric is going to be extraordinarily hard to, I would think, operationalize and defend. And there are other questions like you're talking about not being arbitrary. There is an arbitrary cut, I'm going to say something that's provocative, between humans and non-humans. Just about everybody on the earth think that non-human species do have a certain value. And how do you take that into account also if you want a universal welfare criteria? And these are very difficult philosophical questions. I have no answer to them, but I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
No, you're clearly right. I mean, this is entering very difficult territory and also philosophically very controversial territory. You do refer to this discussion about the utility and the value of human life. And that's, I mean, we try to be closer to this average utility, where it's sort of we only consider the well-being of the people, the average well-being of people who are alive. And also we have a very strong egalitarian view here, because we really want to do this for different subpopulations. I mean, unless many of the other indicators, we can have the years of good life for men and women separately, for different ethnic groups, and so on. So of course, how that should be estimated in the future will be based on lots of scenarios and lots of models in which we try to quantitatively capture this feedback, partly based on empirical measurements and partly based on the model-based assumptions. Yes. Now, your provocative, as you said, question about the value of species other than the human species. I mean, I had also lots of discussions with philosophers about this. And the answer is yes, we as humans, we can only in our minds value whatever we want to value. There is no objective value of anything in the world. So if other species want to value themselves, they should value themselves, but we as humans value the feedback and the importance of these of the nature of the ecosystem support to us humans. In the end, it says that this is what is sometimes called a bit in a negative sense an anthropocentric view of the world, but at least the philosophers I talk to say there is no other than an anthropocentric view possible for human beings, because everything else, if we assign value to some animals, then this is our aesthetic or our own thinking. We don't know what these animals themselves value. So it's a really very hard thing, but the short answer is that, I mean, as human beings, probably we are stuck pretty much to considering the feedback on human well-being, which of course and that's where also the subjective well-being comes in. If we may feel very unhappy and very unsatisfied if biodiversity is declining, even if it does not have any immediate consequences, if the pandas should be disappearing. And so of course this is some unsatisfaction. If some bacteria are disappearing that we may not even know about, then we are probably less worried about this.
Okay, probably the only session or a keynote where we talk about bacteria, but Susanna, what is your point?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very thought-provoking keynote. So I thank you very much for that. I was thinking about your life satisfaction indicator is very subjective indicator, but what I have heard from those well-being indicators is that sometimes when you are low educated, very poor, or more ignorant in life, you feel more well about your life. So, and if you have the education there, and if you're saying if education is increasing, so how would the interaction between these two, do you have in your data to see how the interaction of life satisfaction and education would play? Because I see Chile there, I see Peru with high well-being, and we know that we have a lot of inequality here. So what do you think about interaction between life satisfaction indicator and the education? And the other thing is just a footnote about, I'm not 65 yet, so I'm not smart and I'm not a philosopher, but I have a husband who loves to talk about Marquis de Condorcet instead of Thomas Malthus. So I was asking if you had included as demographer Marquis de Condorcet on your list of philosophers, because the whole thing about demography and the whole population essay started that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Just let me start with the last point in this advanced introduction demography, I give a lot of attention to Marquis de Condorcet, and actually he is my hero in a way, and not Malthus. So, and in particular also his emphasis on education and empowerment through education, how you gain autonomy, and that's, I think, as valid today as it was when he wrote it. Now, this also sort of brings me to the next question of your question, asking about the effect of education on happiness and life satisfaction. And here again, in the subjective well-being, there is really, as I said, firstly, the world is really divided among people who only believe in the objective and others who only believe in the subjective. And then even within the subjective, there's a subdivision of people who rather prefer to what's called happiness, and the other is life satisfaction. Happiness is more a momentous situation. Do you feel happy? And you can feel happy in the morning and feel unhappy in the afternoon. Life satisfaction is typically seen as more reflective, like you look back on your life, what you have achieved, how does this match with what you want, who you want to be and what you want to achieve. That's more in the Aristotelian sense of this eudaimonia that I think refers better to the life satisfaction. Now, what is the empirical evidence? Actually, I think my colleague Erich Strisning is listening here, and he has done quite some empirical analysis on life satisfaction, happiness, as well as education. And what you would expect is that people who know more about the world are also sort of less satisfied because they know what they don't have, they know what they cannot achieve. And that's what some philosophers claim without looking at the empirical data. But the empirical data, at least on average, seems to show that on average, people with higher education do indeed have higher happiness scores and higher life satisfaction because they are more autonomous. They think they have the world better. They understand better what's happening to them. They are not just a victim that sort of fatalistically has to take whatever is given to you and life is given. But Eric, do you want to come in? Are you there? Well, maybe he's not anymore. Okay. Sure, maybe he's just not listening at the moment. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So were you done in your answer to Susanna?
Yeah, I was.
Okay, okay. So yes, thanks, Susanna, for these interesting points. I also was thinking, because I was asking you about why you didn't include more dimension in your single indicators, more sub-dimension in a way to mimic like those representations where you have, like, say, the 10 basic human needs. But then we could go also the other way around. We could try to remove from the yoga, I guess, everything that's not health in a way, or autonomy, health, freedom. And I was wondering why poverty is there when education is on the right-hand side of the equation. I think it would be more powerful to really have as an outcome, as your single outcome, this measure of autonomy in a way, or autonomous years of life, and to have then all the basic human needs on the right side that need to be met by many different ways. Education is one way, human capital, but why not also think of poverty that way, with, you know, governmental measure to help everybody reach that minimal, I mean, to get out of the poverty trap, to get above the poverty rate. What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, well, these are very important, difficult questions. So we've had a lot of back and forth, how many dimensions we consider. The problem is, of course, the more dimensions you take into account, the more problems you have on the empirical side, on the data side. And so we also want to compare this over time and even project into the future. Many of these multidimensional poverty or other many dimensions of social contact, for instance, probably the one aspect that we have least considered is sort of the social context, but that is even the more, because it's so much also culture driven, the more difficult to project into the future. Why poverty? I mean, why also did we take this minimum threshold approach? First of all, it's not entirely without weighting, but it's sort of a Boolean approach. We said that only if you are above a threshold level on all these 4 dimensions that we have, which is out of poverty, cognitive, physical health, and subjective well-being. Only if all together, then the year is counted. So you cannot compensate, let's say, by higher income for being less satisfied in your life, or being poor. So you need to have, it's of course one specific choice, but we are really guided, and that's also by this capabilities approach. And we've talked about Nussbaum and Sen, and I mean also the Human Development Index has these 3 dimensions of the cognitive, the health, and the poverty, and sort of we try to be guided by this. But of course, there is lots of compromises we have to do between the aspirations for all of these 6 criteria that I mentioned. That in particular, sort of the empirical, and what Tom Lagrange said just before, like all the challenges that we have of projecting this into the future. Of course, it's easier to only project life expectancy. That's what we are doing in population forecasts already. And that is sort of anchor. And that brings me to the last point. I think sort of being alive is a necessary prerequisite. It's theoretically mentioned by all of these well-being theories. But even if you then, even the Human Development Index, you can sort of compensate for years of life by a higher income, for instance. And as I said, that I think particularly if this should be seen as a criterion for optimizing, you should rule out the possibility that you optimize the average value by eliminating the weaker members of society. Otherwise, you need sort of extra rules that do not allow this. But if you have longevity built in the indicator, this is part of your objective function. So that's why I think that this survival is the absolute first order prerequisite, as Martin Nussbaum says, and other people in this field. And then the other sort of attributes, what kind of survival are we looking at?
Yes. And that's where there is some room for still discussion and
Yes,
thinking, I think, into how you qualify these years of life. But are there any other questions or remarks? Perhaps I can conclude by saying that I think this is really a remarkable enterprise initiative where you try to bring in all these big paradigms, really. And then, of course, in the details, there are now critics of the capability approach. Things have been moving also even further. So this is just perhaps a start of your modeling. But I think this is a very powerful way where you can perhaps bring in demography into this conversation, into this important discussion, and the sustainability science are there, and we need to be there. So I think, Wolfgang, thank you very much for leading one ship in that direction. And I think it's a really great initiative and paradigm that you're pushing forward. So with this, I think I'm going to conclude this session. Yes, Susanna, I want to applaud as well. Thank you all for being here. And I think we now, very soon, hopefully we'll all see each other in the closing session that's coming up in just a bit. Thank you again, Wolfgang, for this inspiring talk, and looking forward to hear more about how this is unfolding.
Thank you all very much for listening, and thank you, Clementine, for running this session and your very thoughtful comments.
And happy birthday, Wolfgang.
Thank you.